КАМП для щоденної підтримки імунітету.
They're being lied to. Dictators, they learn from the way the world responds. There is no peace without victory for Ukraine.
Ми продовжуємо проєкт Joint Efforts Canada&Ukraine спільними зусиллями до перемоги. Я Оксана Мельник і ми розпочинаємо сьогоднішній випуск. Сьогодні у мене в гостях канадський політик Гарнет Дженус. Слава Україні!
Героям слава! Great to be with you.
Власне, наше інтерв'ю я хочу розпочати з питання наступного. 24 лютого 2022 рік. В себе в соціальних мережах ви опублікували наступний допис. Події в Україні руйнівні. Ми повинні бути рішучими. Міцна допомога Україні. Застосувати санкції проти Росії. Життя України і достовірність всієї міжнародної системи висить на балансі. Молюся за хоробрих українських воїнів та за мирних жителів, які також перебувають у групі ризику. Я зобов'язуюся використовувати всі доступні інструменти, щоб підштовхнути наш уряд робити дії, які призведуть до миру в Україні. Чи вдалося вам зі своєї сторони реалізувати потужну підтримку від канадського уряду для України?
Well, thank you for the question and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit with you today. Just thinking back to those sentiments, we're very much in this struggle still. Obviously, the people of Ukraine, the soldiers, civilians, and others who are contributing to the effort, the struggle is still ongoing. And the political struggle in other countries to push governments to do more, to keep this issue at the top of the agenda. That struggle is ongoing. So I wouldn't say the work of supporting Ukraine is complete, nowhere near. And even after the war is over, we'll need to be there for rebuilding, strengthening relationships, and taking whatever steps are required for contributing to regional security. So this is a relationship, this is a struggle that's going to continue in various forms, and we need to continue to be there. I look back over the past year in terms of the advocacy we've done, and I think we've had a lot of successes. I think there have been various steps taken, and from the opposition, we continue to push the government to do more, to take various additional steps that are required. One big area of focus for us in the fall was around the decision by the Government of Canada to grant a waiver to sanctions for Gazprom turbines. The Liberal government made the decision to allow the export of certain Gazprom turbines. We strongly opposed that. We called for emergency meetings of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We had various studies on that, various hearings, and in the end, right kind of before the adjournment of the fall session of Parliament, the government reversed course and pulled that waiver. So it does show that within our democratic politics, although most of the power is in the hands of the government, an aggressive, active opposition can play a role. And I think the efforts that we pursued through the Foreign Affairs Committee on that issue were very important. And that issue created space for us to talk more about other aspects of support, about humanitarian assistance, about weapons, about other actions that are required. So we've had some successes, but there's more work that's needed. And I think what the Gazprom issue showed as well is that the government might talk a good talk on Ukraine, but the role the opposition is playing, pushing the government to be steadfast, is important because the government tried to back off with the Gazprom waiver, and it was because of those efforts in Parliament that we were able to get them to reverse course and pull that waiver back.
Thank you. Нам потрібні 3 основні інструменти, про які заявляє гучно наш президент Володимир Зеленський. Це санкції, кошти і зброя. Чи готова Канада надалі підтримувати Україну до її перемоги? Адже це повинен бути безперервний процес.
Canada is engaged in certain respects on all 3 of those areas, and there are potential questions about what more can be done in all of those areas. So one of the issues that we're continuing to pursue is the effective enforcement of sanctions. The government talks about the sanctions they've imposed, but I think sometimes there are gaps in terms of the effectiveness of the enforcement of those sanctions. We have legislation that allows sanctioned assets to be repurposed and to be used for recovery. So in a sense, combining two of those points, right? Providing additional support to Ukraine by using sanctioned assets. It's great that the legislation exists, but it being used to actually do that is a critical next step. So we're continuing to press the government on issues of sanctions, applying sanctions, but also effective sanctions enforcement and use of the tools that are required. We see continuing discussion of weapons. I think we could have been a bit quicker on provision of weapons. So I want to acknowledge that some things have been done by the government, but and the same goes for humanitarian support. We're following these fronts. We're saying, is the government actually following through on their commitments, and are they moving fast enough on these fronts? So Canada's engaged in all these areas, but as the opposition, we're looking at the gaps and the areas where there needs to be increased effectiveness and follow through.
Ми розуміємо, що якщо Україна програє, далі Росія нападе на Польщу і далі піде у Європу. На вашу думку, як і яким чином світ повинен зупинити Путіна і агресію на Україну, на Європу і на війну? Тому що наразі відбувається виключно геноцид українського народу. І це дійсно так.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that there is no peace without victory for Ukraine. If Ukraine were to be defeated, that the insatiable appetite of Putin for more blood, more territory, more control would simply continue. And the only way then to ensure peace and stability in Europe and around the world is decisive, clear Ukrainian victory and peace on terms that recognize the full territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. I think what we've seen historically is that aggressive dictators, they learn from the way the world responds. And in fact, Putin has already learned from past responses. If we had been stronger in our response to the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, at the time I think Canada was strong, but there wasn't the same consistency in follow-up in terms of holding Russia accountable then. Even if you go back further, the invasion of Georgia, Putin's actions, horrific disregard for civilian life in Chechnya. If you go back and see the historic failure of other countries to confront the Putin regime, establish the conditions in which Putin thought he could get away with these things. And so the response has been stronger this time, and that's a good thing. But suffice it to say, if we don't ensure a Ukrainian victory, then Putin will learn the lesson of that situation and he'll go further. If Putin is defeated, he will also learn the lesson from that situation and be forced to recalibrate.
Весь світ вважає Путіна терористом. Ви погоджуєтесь з цим твердженням?
I think clearly he's acting in a way that's designed to cause terror for civilians. What other definition of a terrorist could there be? I think he's showing capricious disregard for human life. I think he's committing war crimes and he's trying to terrorize people in order to get their will. We've seen in some of the recent evident targeting of civilian infrastructure clearly that's the mentality, that's the approach.
Росія робила фактаж на те, що Київ і Україну візьме за 3 дні. Так, 3 дні і Україна би належала Росії. Ми розуміли, що це виключно фейкова інформація, тому що українці і ми такий народ, що ми за нашу державу, ми йдемо до кінця. На вашу думку, як зараз світ на дипломатичному рівні сприймає Україну?
So, I mean, in the early days, I think there was a lot of uncertainty, even a lot of pessimism about what would happen. I remember at the time just kind of waking up every morning and checking Twitter to see like, okay, were they able to hang on? And it's been incredible what the Ukrainian people have been able to achieve. I think there was a real underestimation of the Ukrainian capacity by many in the West, but also by the Russian regime. Authoritarian states have a tendency to believe their own propaganda. They tell a lie enough until they actually believe it. And this lie, there would be sympathy for what Putin was doing inside Ukraine. This lie, it would be sort of an easy thing to do. Clearly, it was shown to be false. And The Ukrainian people have shown such courage, such heroism. I think the reality is the Russian military's failures have really undermined the prestige of the Russian government. A new conversation inside of Russia, hopefully it forces a political change as people realize that they are being lied to. They're being lied to by a regime that is willing to send their sons to their deaths with no regard for the consequences, simply to try to just double down on a failed approach.
Якщо брати до уваги сьогодення, на вашу думку, чого не вистачає Україні для перемоги?
Well, I think Ukraine has fought incredibly, and we've seen some of the counteroffensives being very successful, obviously. And I'm not an expert on the nitty-gritty of military strategy. I think my approach as a politician outside is to listen to what the government of Ukraine, the people of Ukraine are saying in terms of their needs, and then to try to encourage our government to be there, recognizing how critically important victory is. But what the government of Ukraine is saying is weapons, financial support, and sanctions, right? Those are the 3 points you mentioned earlier. And so we should be always looking for ways to ramp up that pressure, ensure the effective enforcement of sanctions consistently across the board, working with our allies to have a more consistent approach as well. And when it comes to sanctions, one of the other issues I think where we can do more on the Canadian side is recognizing the contribution we can make to global energy security. There are some respects in which our economy is similar to Russia's. Both countries are major natural resource producers and exporters. So Canada can provide an alternative for countries that rely on energy, but also food and fertilizer. We can displace Russian natural resource exports in Europe and also in East Asia. We have to be willing to recognize the urgency of that situation, develop our resources, develop pipeline infrastructure and other things that allows us to make those contributions. But we need to see energy as a security issue, not just as an economic issue, but also a security issue. So if we can step up and play that role, I think that will make sanctions against Russia more effective. From what we've heard, parliamentary committees and elsewhere, some of the sanctions, technology-based sanctions, for instance, have been quite effective. But in terms of the overall Russian economy, they're still able to export a lot of energy resources, and at current prices, they're still able to bring in revenue associated with that. I think the other thing we can do on this front is engage with some other countries in the region. I would like to see, for instance, India doing more to move away from Russia. We can hopefully try to build more of a global consensus around supporting Ukraine, not just between Canada and Europe, but also including other countries.
Thank you. 18 березня 2022 рік у вас з'являється наступний допис в своїх соціальних мережах разом з українським прапором. І ви фіксуєте, що якщо ви живете в Шервуд-Парк, Форт-Саскачеван, це незабаром прибуде до вашої поштової скриньки. Будь ласка, подумайте про показ цього у вашому вікні, щоб висловити свою підтримку. З чим, власне, була пов'язана дана ідея?
Yeah, so in my constituency, we have a large Ukrainian diaspora community. It's one of, if not the largest of any federal constituency in Canada. So I work a lot on foreign policy issues, but of all the issues I work on, the Ukraine issue is most likely to have resonance within my own constituency. We also have even Ukrainian language bilingual programs in some of the local schools. So there is that close connection. And so people in my riding have been very active in various ways wanting to support Ukraine. And that's been running for a long time, before this war certainly. Various aspects of Ukrainian national life, people in my constituency have been involved in that. And I know that when the war started, there was a lot of fear among people who had family members in Ukraine. So I wanted to give people an opportunity to show their support. So we mailed around just a simple mailer which had on one side of it an image of the Ukrainian flag and invited people to display it as a way of showing their support for Ukraine and also expressing to people in their neighborhood who may be of Ukrainian origin or have family members back in Ukraine, their community is with them and supporting them. And it was great to see the strong level of response that received, many people choosing to display that flag in their doors, and for me to be able to drive through residential areas and see that sign of support. Some people may be skeptical of little symbolic gestures like this because they wonder, does this really have an impact? But I think we have to recognize the psychological dimension of warfare as well, that when people around the world are thinking about Ukraine, are expressing support for Ukraine, that drives the conversation, that gives, I think, people fighting in Ukraine a greater sense of the international community being behind them, and it does help to strengthen those efforts. It also sends a message to the government of Russia, to the people of Russia, that this war is wrong, is not supported internationally, and that it has consequences for them. So, it's not the most important thing, but I think these kinds of gestures are nice and worthwhile, and I was glad to see so many people participate in it.
Канадський уряд потужно підтримує Україну. Не було ще такої програми, яка була надана українцям. Мова йде про QED. Так, українці емігрували до Канади, так, тимчасово, так, ми це фіксуємо, але ми розуміємо, що березень і програма завершується. Чи наразі, так, працює канадський уряд над тим, аби продовжити програму і надалі надати правового статусу українцям? Ми розуміємо, ми маємо study permit, work permit, it's okay, але ми повинні розуміти, як далі, на яких умовах українці можуть залишитись в Канаді. Моє питання заключається в наступному. Чи працює канадський уряд над даним питанням?
I'm not an expert on the immigration side of it. I do more work on the foreign policy side of it. I think it's very valuable that Ukrainians were able to come here and are able to come. In fact, conservatives were pushing for provisions allowing for visa-free travel in general for Ukrainians to make it easier for more people to be able to come here. In terms of how long that's extended for, obviously some people that have come to Canada are going to stay permanently. That's sort of inevitable as people establish relationships and connections and may move towards permanence. I think many people will want to go back and be part of the rebuilding process afterwards. So I think it has to be kind of an evolving process as we see what's happening on the ground, what the needs are, and how we can contribute to those. Obviously, we're all hoping for a speedy end to the war and victory. But at that point, there still will have to be a bit of a conversation, recognizing that some people will want to stay here permanently and have established some connections. So I think it's kind of the sort of thing that has to evolve as we see what unfolds.
Канада дійсно повинна відстоювати свободу та демократію. Ви про це заявляли неодноразово. Як, на вашу думку, справляється з підтримкою так наразі канадський уряд? Ми з вами поговорили. Також нам надзвичайно приємно, що ви особисто ведете власний блог, так, і подкаст на підтримку України. Розкажіть, будь ласка, про це більш детально. Як виникла ідея?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's been striking about Canadians' response to this conflict is how imminent it is to us because of new technology, right? The fact that we can see what people in Ukraine are saying on Twitter, the fact that I know people that are there that are sending images of things they're seeing or experiencing. There is a much greater sort of sense of imminence of the conflict. And people are looking to hear directly from the ground. And I think also part of the dynamic is there's emerging mistrust in traditional media. So people want to have a sense of hearing those firsthand reports. What are people who are living through these things seeing and experiencing? So when I first had an intern in my office from Ukraine, we decided to help bring this information directly to people. So we did weekly interviews with people that were on the ground doing work from various sides, looking at it kind of from an agriculture perspective, from a military perspective, seeing different aspects of it, and just helping to deepen the sense of solidarity and connection that people have. I think as a way of really getting the realities of what's happening into people's minds and helping to strengthen support for Ukraine. And I think this is the kind of work that needs to continue. It's been a year. The nature of news is that things can move out of the headlines, even if they're still going on, because they might still be happening, but they're not new anymore, right? So continuing to renew people's awareness of the reality of this situation is really important for sustaining that support over the long term.
Ми знаємо, що українська аудиторія дивиться ваш проект. Чи досліджували ви, чи канадська аудиторія слідкує за даним проектом і чи дивиться його?
I think there was a lot of interest in it. We had a great response to it, and it was something that we had a lot of positive feedback on from my constituency and from across the country. Yeah.
Минулого року ви особисто висунули пропозицію засудити спроби Росії примусово анексувати українську територію. Як відреагувала на неї Палата громад?
We had unanimous support in the House of Commons for that motion, so a positive moment in terms of the Canadian House of Commons expressing itself in support of Ukraine. That provides us with the momentum for pushing for follow-up, right? The House of Commons recognizes that these are illegitimate processes, and therefore we need to continue to support Ukraine towards a victory.
Мені також відомо, що ви особисто відвідували Україну. Розкажіть про ці візити і чим вразила вас, власне, Україна?
Yeah, so I was in Ukraine in 2016, and this was celebrating the 25th anniversary of independence. The year before, we in Canada celebrated our 150th anniversary of becoming a country. And so I was reflecting a little bit on the contrast between that. When a country's been around for 150 years as an independent, self-governing country, obviously nobody remembers. It's a matter of history, right? What happened. So there's a lightness to Canadian national celebration, right? We have parades where people throw out candy and wave flags and wear colored hats, but it's kind of it's purely celebratory. It was very moving for me to experience Ukraine's Independence Day because it felt much more weighty and somber. Of course, there's celebration and joy associated with it, but even in 2016, parts of Ukraine were occupied and Ukraine was at war, and most people would have some memory of a time before they had an independent country. Of course, Ukraine as an identity has been around for hundreds of years before they had an independent country. So there was a real sense of gravity and intensity to those celebrations that was different. There was a parade, but it was a military parade. It was a look at the equipment we're using to defend ourselves. So it really just brought home for me the fragility of freedom. And in that sense, it was a deeply meaningful celebration of nationhood. People celebrating something that they know is fragile and that they know is only there because they have had to and continue to have to fight to preserve it. You know, in Canada, we're blessed by geography. We're beside the United States, right? Ukraine struggles with its location, right? It doesn't have the same advantage that we have in terms of neighbor. I think that just brings home the support we need to provide for Ukraine. I don't have any Ukrainian heritage, but it's interesting when you spend time in a country, you can really develop an appreciation and a love for that place that you can't from a distance, right? You can read about another country in books and you can look at pictures and you can understand theoretically, but it's by being there physically that you can really get to know. So I was there for a short time, but I met with a lot of different people who were struggling in various ways to serve their country and make their country better. And it's an experience that I will carry with me for the rest of my life.
Чи вважаєте ви українців героями на даний момент?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
І моє крайнє запитання на сьогодні: чи будете ви святкувати перемогу України?
Yes, I hope to see that victory soon. It's going to continue to be a struggle for the Ukrainian nation to overcome all of the challenges that have been created. We need to see a military victory. We need to see continuing support for rebuilding. And I think in the long run, we need to see political change in Russia, because if the Putin regime persists in its position, it will continue to be a menace to international peace and security. And that's why, as part of my work on this issue, it's been very important for me to also voice support for the Russian opposition and call for the government of Canada to be supporting the Russian opposition. But this is the ongoing kind of long-term issue, is supporting Ukraine to victory and supporting the aspiration of peoples everywhere for freedom, democracy, self-government, and to be out from under the thumb of autocrats and authoritarians. I hope we'll be able to celebrate this victory soon. I hope to be able to go back to Ukraine and celebrate in Sevastopol the freedom and independence of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!